I'd like to introduce David Best. He's a professor and director of the Centre for Addiction Recovery Research at Leeds Trinity University. He holds senior academic posts in a range of universities internationally. He's a founding member of the College of Lived Experience Recovery Organisations in the UK and of the Inclusive Recovery Cities movement, where he's the chair of the Inclusive Recovery Cities UK. Trained as a psychologist and criminologist, he worked in private practice, research and policy in the areas of addiction, recovery and rehab of people in custody. He's one of the leading academics in the area of addiction recovery and a key innovator in developing recovery capital measurement tools and methods. His soon-to-be published book will summarise the existing and emerging evidence around the concept of recovery capital. So David's joining us online from the UK, so I'd also like to thank him for waking up at 2 a.m. to be doing this for us. Take it away, David.
You can make up your own mind about whether I've managed to wake up or not. So, I'm slowly coming round. So, look, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. It's always slightly painful listening to those kind of bios getting read out. So, I guess the most important thing for you to know is I've been working in the addictions area for about 33, 34 years. And the last, 15 years or so, the vast majority of my work has been about recovery. And in that time, I've collected something like 4,000 recovery stories in different countries, in different studies and projects. And really what I'm going to do over the course of the next 40 minutes or so is review that evidence for you. I'm going to split my talk into three parts. So the first part is about recovery theory and recovery research. And then the second part is going to be about much more specifically around measurement and how we measure recovery, because particularly when I lived and worked in Australia, it was one of the main criticisms was this is a vague, weak, poorly specified topic. And then the last area I'm going to talk about is the kind of collective model that was mentioned in the introduction there about inclusive recovery cities, which for me is a really exciting thing, and I'll try and leave as much time as possible for talking about that. So enough by the way of prelude. Let me just get straight to what I'm talking about. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with Scottish accents, but I did just want to quote the great Scottish comedian Billy Connolly. For anyone who's struggling with my accent, Billy Connolly once said, Glaswegian is a regional accent. It's not a fucking speech impediment. So for people who are struggling, I'm not really going to apologise. Anyway, so onwards. The first thing to say about a recovery model is it's not unique in academic world, because in areas like restorative justice, therapeutic jurisprudence, the mental health recovery movement, a strength-based model has become much, much more common and much more prevalent. And, in my own work, I do quite a lot of work in prisons where strength-based approaches are now becoming quite a significant shift in the way that rehabilitation is done in a prison context. But I guess to put into context what we mean by a recovery approach, I want to outline what's on this slide, which really are some of the fundamental shifts. And I guess it's really important to say a recovery model is not simply about adding something on, because there's a fundamental paradigm shift, a different way of doing things. And the first part of this is it requires a kind of greater humility on the part of the professional or the service, because effectively you have to shed a little bit of your expert status, because a recovery model is predicated on partnership. It's not an expert-based approach. You have to accept that the individual is the driver of their own journey, and you're effectively walking alongside them on that journey. The second thing is, and this is hugely important, is it fundamentally switches what we try and do from the reduction and removal of deficits to the building of strengths. And just to give you an example of that, I did some of my earliest training and work at the Institute of Psychiatry in London. And early on, I used to run for a little while a brief assessment clinic in the Stockwell project in Brixton. And there, I would go in, I'd have to interview 6 people in a 3-hour window, half an hour each. And essentially, what I'd do is I'd have a big long questionnaire that assessed tell me about your drug problems, your alcohol problems, your crime problems, your relationship problems, your physical health problems, your mental health problems, your housing problems, and so on. It was an exercise in pathologizing. It was deficit driven. And the fundamental assumption is you make a list of everything that's wrong with folk, and then I assume the aim is to try and say, get rid of all those things, minimize or remove as many of those deficits or pathologies as possible. That isn't the starting point for a recovery project or a strengths-based project. The idea there is you find out what people want, what they're good at, what they need, what they have, and that's the starting point. You don't start from the point of the deficit. You also don't assume that treatment services, clinics, or recovery services have the answers. Basically, people recover in their families, in their communities, and that it's an intrinsically and fundamentally social process of change. Recovery is something that happens between people. It's not, the assumption is not that it's something that happens in a pathologized mind or a diseased body. It's a fundamentally interpersonal process of change. The other crucial thing that's just massively influential is recovery is assumed to be fundamentally a social contagion. It primary mechanism of transmission of recovery is social contagion. In other words, basically the model is I want what you've got and I'll do what you do to have what you have. So it's a social process of change. And therefore, and one of the fundamental assumptions of this model is that the mechanism of creating communities of recovery is to make recovery as visible, accessible, and attractive as possible. And that model attracts recovery change and recovery movement. And one of the big projects that I'm working on at the moment is around measuring the well-being of the peer workforce. And in the pilot study we've done, which we're just writing up just now, there's a very strong triangular relationship between the individual's own recovery well-being and their generic well-being, their perceived ability to help other people support their recovery journeys, and the perception of the strength of the staff they work beside. In other words, that sense of kind of belonging and drawing on the strength of colleagues is essentially part of both supporting their own well-being and their perceived ability to support others. One of the challenges from a research or science point of view is that tends to mean that we have to rely much, much more on local context. So the basic principle of replication doesn't apply in the same way because the assumption is it's locally managed and moderated moving forward. All right, enough of that as a kind of basis of assumptions about a strength-based model. Let me tell you some basic ideas about what recovery looks like and on what the underlying assumptions are. There's 2 basic ways of framing what supports that long-term recovery journey. The first way of phrasing it is jobs, friends, and houses. The second is somewhere to live, someone to love, and something to do. In other words, and they will be the golden threads of my talk moving forward, that the fundamental assumption of how people recover is that it's really about psychological and physical safety, social networks and social support systems, and meaningful activities moving forward. So we tend to define stable recovery as the third phase of a recovery journey. So essentially, the argument would be that it takes people approximately 5 years on average, and it varies individual to individual, but fundamentally it's a 5-year journey. Most people do, however, make it. So according to SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, in the United States, 58% of people with a lifetime substance use disorder will eventually achieve stable recovery. And I'm just going to use one of the earliest studies I did in this area as an illustration of the social effect. So this is a study we called the Goya study, after the Spanish painter Francisco Goya, and I'll explain why in a second. And what we did was we studied the recovery well-being pathways of people who in recovery from alcohol problems and heroin problems in two British cities, Glasgow, which is my home city, and Birmingham. And what we found was the two strongest predictors of well-being were, one, a social effect, how much time you spent with other people in recovery. Moose argued that recovery is a process of social learning and social control. Copying others in their recovery journey, belonging to groups that help to shape your behaviour. The second thing we found, which was more of a surprise to us, was we took a basic count of how much time in the last month people had spent engaging in a range of activities. And essentially, the more time people spend engaged in those activities, the better the recovery well-being. And essentially, this was something that 6 years later we replicated in recovery housing in Florida, where we found that basically that engaging with recovery groups and recovery communities helps to create the conditions for recovery. Engaging in meaningful activity help to build strengths in people. So for me, this is fundamental to the process of change. I'm going to briefly talk about a European study. This was a Horizon 2020 study that I had the pleasure of leading. Oh, sorry, I forgot to say. Why is this called the Goya study? That's really important. You can tell I'm still half asleep. Why is this called the Goya study? Goya is an incredibly sophisticated research term that stands for get off your arse. The more you do, the better you do. So the more people engaged in meaningful activity, the better they did in their recovery journey. All right, on to moving about a decade forward. I was lucky enough to lead a European study of recovery pathways in Scotland, England, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and it was a great team of people who were involved in this study. And essentially, we recruited at the start of the study, which was the year before COVID lockdown, which also makes it a year before I was last in Australia. We were able to recruit a cohort of people that were divided between people in early, sustained, and stable recovery at the start of the study. So, two main effects. The first is vindication of that theory of staged recovery. People who were in early recovery, so in the first year of recovery when we recruited them, 30% relapsed in the first year. For people who were in sustained recovery, so had 1 to 5 years of recovery time, 17.6% relapsed. For people who had 5 years of continuous sobriety, 1.5 or 1 in 65 relapsed in the course of the study time. And essentially, the next bullet point is the crucial one. For people who engaged in at least some form of peer-based recovery support services, they did better. However, replicating a study by Fiorentini et al. In 1999 in the United States, we also found that people who engaged with both specialist treatment and with recovery support services did better than people who engaged with only one of those things. And for me, this was crucial because effectively what it suggested, contrary to a lot of belief from my time in Australia and certainly here in the UK, that people either go down the road of 12-step mutual aid or other peer-based support groups, or they go down the road of professional treatment. We found that people who did both did better. So, moving on. The next slide is borrowed from the mental health field. And this is a wonderful model, I think, which isn't so much about the natural genesis of recovery. It's more about how services can provide support for people to help them achieve their recovery journey. And it's based on a systematic review conducted by Leamy and colleagues at the Institute of Psychiatry in 2011, published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, that effectively summarised 87 papers that provided evidence of what supports recovery, effective recovery from mental health problems. And they summarised the evidence using a wonderful acronym called CHIME. And CHIME stands for connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. And in my work, I use this model quite a lot. And it's fabulous, and it's nearly in the right order, but sadly, Chimay doesn't sound as good. Because for me, the underlying model is positive, meaningful, genuine social connection, particularly to peers who've already done that journey, generates the hope and belief that change is possible. And that hope and belief provides the fuel or the activity that gets people involved in meaningful activities. Those meaningful activities then create a positive cycle of changes in personal identity to a more positive personal identity and a sense of empowerment. If you like, you can call this efficacy and effectiveness. So CHIME model is crucial. However, for me, and the underlying model we have, and I'm just about to publish a blog on this over the course of the weekend, is that the CHIME model is predicated on the assumption that effectively the community creates the conditions for human connection that generate the model. And this is going back to this kind of social epidemiological model where the social contagion of recovery relies on its visibility, accessibility, and attractiveness to allow the positive social connections that allow the internal social changes. You will see that this is a dynamic model, and I've deliberately put the different kinds of recovery capital almost upside down on the diagram on the right-hand side, because effectively I wanted to suggest in this that the processes of CHIME and the three types of recovery capital, more of which shortly, are dynamically interrelated. But the fundamental assumption here, and the fundamental assumption for me about recovery generally, is people will vary in the assets, strengths, and resources they have. And that in turn interacts with the community resources available to them. So effectively, the community creates the conditions that allows recovery to happen or that blocks it from happening. For instance, if there are high levels of stigma, exclusion, and so on. Okay, so moving on to section 2. I'll just take another drink of coffee so I don't have the indignity of starting snoring in the middle of the talk. Right, recovery capital and measurement. As I said, I lived and worked in Australia between 2011 and 2014, and I tried to champion at various times a recovery model, and I was heavily criticised in some quarters on the grounds of saying, look, it's all God, spirituality, and other unmeasurable nonsense. And what effectively recovery capital has done is to provide us with a kind of metric, a measurement system that allows us to map and measure recovery and recovery strengths in people. So from a science point of view, it's given us something that's allowed us to test and to create a common metric for the language of a kind of recovery science. And in the introduction, it was mentioned that we're producing a book which came out in April, which is the Handbook of Recovery Capital. And I'm delighted that this is out because effectively this is edited chapters that include authors from Australia, as well as people from the UK, Belgium, the United States, who all have provided evidence around the measurement and mapping of recovery strengths using a recovery capital framework. And really, for those of you who might feel recovery is an unevidenced area, there is now a growing recovery science, which I think demonstrates clearly the growth of the evidence base around recovery and our increasing sophistication about measurement. So what are we actually talking about when we talk about recovery capital? In 1999, two American academics, Bob Granfield and William Cloud, wrote a book called Coming Clean. And Coming Clean effectively was an exploration of 44 people who achieved a stable recovery without going near a treatment service or a 12-step group. And sometimes that's referred to as auto-remission or natural recovery, but it kind of provoked questions about how did they do it? Why didn't they have to go near treatment services? And it wasn't about the quantity or the frequency of their drug use, or indeed about the severity of their dependence or problems on I think it was all illicit drugs. And what they basically argued was that how people managed to overcome those problems was to do with the breadth and depth of the internal and external resources that could be drawn upon to initiate and sustain recovery from alcohol and other drug problems. In the same year, William White, who is the kind of guru of the recovery field and is based in Florida in the United States, along with William Cloud, argued that stable recovery is best predicted on the basis of recovery assets, not on the basis of pathologies or problems. My very own academic hero, who is an Australian gentleman called John Braithwaite, who is the founder of the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University, wrote a fabulous book, published a fabulous book in 2022 called Macrocriminology and Freedom. And he makes an argument that for me is crucial to the contribution of recovery to a strengths-based model, but also makes the point of avoiding the kind of atomism of assuming that addiction or recovery are embodied. So he argues that social capital, human capital, restorative capital, and recovery capital are unlike financial capital in that they are not depleted through use. When you spend your money from the bank, you deplete your capital. When you trust someone, you do not deplete trust. Trust tends to be reciprocated, and this engenders virtuous circles of trust building. A politics of hope is likewise redemptive as we face adversity. It is infectious. Now, the word we use is contagious, not infectious, but the whole point here is that we have to think of recovery as something not embodied in individuals, as something that's a fundamental social process. And so its process of transmission is fundamentally social and interpersonal as well. My role in this process was that I guess I really have, over the course of pretty much since we did this paper. So in 2010, along with an American researcher called Alexandra Lodi, we published a paper for the Royal Society for the Arts in London, where we started the process of operationalising how you would count recovery capital. And the top left-hand slice of the pie, we basically, we called personal recovery capital, and essentially it was about things like resilience, coping skills, self-esteem, self-efficacy, and communication skills. And what we argued was that these are the kind of qualities that help people to endure in the long term, but it's the other two slices of the pie, what we call social recovery capital and collective, or what you now call community recovery capital, that create almost, this is a really terrible mixed metaphor, but create the scaffolding around the individual that provides people with the conditions and opportunities. So Longabow's 2010 paper argues very strongly that the single biggest predictor of recovery transition is transition in social networks from networks supportive of drinking or drug use to networks supportive of recovery. And my argument would be that is matched by the community's willingness or ability to provide the supports that allow long-term recovery change to happen. In that period of time, we have produced a number of different measures and metrics of recovery capital. And by far the most widely used of which is called the RECCAP. And the REC cap is an instrument that takes about 15 to 20 minutes to complete in its basic form. And the REC cap effectively measures 5 different things: personal capital, social capital, community capital, barriers to recovery, and unmet needs. And it's an online form, and the score profile that you can see there is effectively what you get the moment you finish completing the form. So you press the submit button, because 2 things became apparent for my earlier work in this area. One, another questionnaire people to fill in document. And 2, people having to wait ages for results is not useful. So effectively what we have with the REC cap is something people complete online. You can do it on an iPad, you can do it on a telephone, whatever. And the scores appear immediately. So effectively we get people to complete the REC cap on a quarterly basis, 4 times a year, and each completion triggers a recovery care planning model. And my former colleagues at Turning Point in Melbourne are using the REC cap as part of one of their projects, their telephone-based projects at the moment. And for people who might say, well, where's the evidence base? Oh, jumped ahead there. For people who might say, where's the evidence base? This is a slide that basically, I promise I won't ask people questions on what's on this slide at the end, but effectively, if anyone is interested, anyone is boring enough as me to be interested in the underpinning research, this is what we have. And incidentally, I've got a PhD student called Shanasa Shahid, who is currently using the REC cap as part of her thesis to look at differences in recovery pathways in the UK among Black, Asian, and white women, to look at, and particularly around what are the community capital barriers and strengths of recovery journeys. And just to give you one example that we published in 2023, we were able to use the REC cap in a wonderful prison-based therapeutic community called HARP in Chesterfield County Jail. And when people complete that programme, they transition straight into recovery residences in Richmond in Virginia in the United States. And we were able to track the growth of recovery capital through the therapeutic community process and continue to build recovery capital and strengths over time. And I guess most of the work, so at the moment we have 2 big programs of doing this work in the United States. One in recovery residences, and we have more than 12,000 completions. And why does that matter? Because in the recovery residences, there are no what people would traditionally call professionals. The forms are all either self-completed by the clients, residents, or they're completed with peer recovery specialists, so effectively a more experienced peer. And nonetheless, we have more than 12,000 completions. The other place where we have rolled this out is in drug courts. So we did a 2-year program with All Rise, who used to be called the National Association of Drug Court Professionals. I'll be in North Carolina the week after next, and as we start the second wave, where we expand up to 8 areas for drug courts for this. And this basically has allowed us to start mapping the norms of what recovery capital we expect to see. And this is from recovery residences, and each of the time points effectively is a 90-day cycle. And you will see that we see clear, dramatic increases in the first 3 to 6 months, and then a more gradual improvement beyond that. But there is not a drop-off in that process. And that's been fine for a recovery residence setting. However, we've tried to develop a much more quick version for community services. So there's a 36 item measure. 12 of the items are around personal recovery capital, 12 are around social recovery capital, and 12 are around community recovery capital. We've called the RCS 36 a much faster, quicker version. But again, the whole point of recovery interventions is they have to do something. And so with the RCS 36, we have also developed what I have here, which are packs of playing cards. And these are effectively recovery care planning tools that we map and measure as part of the process. So when you do your assessment, it will suggest what the areas of strengths you have are and how that then feeds into growth and change over time. All right. And I think it's also important to say, in the traditions of the original Granfield and Cloud model, the assumption is for the vast majority of people that I see in recovery residence, incidentally, for people who are not aware of how recovery residences work, they basically draw their population from two groups: people coming out of jail and people coming from homeless services in the United States. So this is not an affluent population. These are people who at the start of the journey have low baseline capital, and that includes low motivation. But the assumption is, particularly for people who have low resources at the start of the recovery journey, we have what we've referred to as an outside-in model. The overall aim and philosophy of the approach is to create the conditions that maximizes the chances of individuals initiating and sustaining their recovery journey. In other words, the model effectively is access to resources in the community, jobs, houses, college courses, etc. Even things like libraries, community support groups, football teams. Create the conditions that allow new social networks to develop, and that in turn creates the framework and scaffolding that supports recovery journey. Now, in this model, it's really important not to see recovery as some form of post-treatment aftercare. And as William White has argued, recovery should precede treatment, not come afterwards. And as a consequence, by making recovery visible and accessible in communities, we potentially, it's not only a form of aftercare and adjunctive support, it's also a form of prevention and early intervention. Which brings me on to the last and what I hope is the most celebratory part of my talk, which is about community capital, inclusive recovery cities, and where we are and where we go next with this. So, this is a picture of my home city, Glasgow, and very unusually, the sun is shining. And this picture is of Glasgow Green, and I think this is from 2010, maybe 2011. This is the Glasgow Recovery Walk, which was the second UK recovery walk. And why do we have these events? And I was delighted. We had a couple of similar events in Melbourne when I lived there. We had the Recovery Academy Australia events. And I think it's really important to say for people who achieve recovery, and I know there might be lots of people there who say, well, not everybody wants recovery. Well, that's fine. But for people who want recovery, it is something worth achieving. It's a sense of achievement and belonging, and that's part of the reason why we celebrate. But there's two other blocks of reasons why we celebrate. The first one is the first block relates to social capital. So there's three bits to this. Why do we have a public facing celebration of recovery? Number one, to bring people together to create what we call bonding social capital. In other words, to bring together And what do we mean by that? This was right in the middle of Glasgow. This was a social event and activity that members of the general public could see that recovery was possible, recovery was attractive, and that recovery wasn't something to be feared. So we created contact and engagement with the general public. So, in other words, how do we measure the effectiveness of public events and public celebrations? By mapping the extent to which it achieves those core things: bonding capital, bridging capital, linking capital. But that's not all. That part of what we're trying to do here is to provide people in the recovery community with access to community resources, to new social networks, provide an opportunity to showcase the talents and capabilities of people in recovery, and also to afford them a chance to volunteer at the activities and events, to feel a part of something. And then crucially, and the bridge to the idea of inclusive recovery cities is it also creates it creates something that contributes to the civic calendar. And we talk more and more about, instead of saying giving back, because the assumption isn't that people have taken things necessarily in their addictions journeys, but to offer an opportunity for what we call reciprocal altruism, that there's an exchange between the recovery community and the broader community that strengthens and enhances collective efficacy and collective well-being in the community. And that really is the underlying principle for I've jumped ahead again too far, for inclusive recovery cities. And inclusive recovery cities basically is around the idea of having at least 4 public-facing events each year and creating an umbrella for engaging the community in the recovery journey through led by lived experience recovery organisations to increase the visibility and awareness of recovery, to improve access to community resources for people at all stages of recovery, to reduce stigma and exclusion, to create positive and inclusive social events, to contribute to citizenship, and to involve participation in a much broader network. So in the UK, we launched this idea with a journal paper in 2018, but we had a launch in 2023 in the football stadium, the Riverside Stadium in Middlesbrough. And Middlesbrough remains probably our best example of a really vibrant recovery community. So just to give you some examples, in Middlesbrough, you see in the bottom left of this slide, there's something called Recovery Ally Training. Well, all of the staff in McDonald's in Middlesbrough are trained in naloxone utilisation, but they're also trained in bringing people along to the recovery community centre and assertively linking people in there. A part of the Building Recovery in Middlesbrough programme as the Inclusive Recovery City is they have a cafe and restaurant called Fork in the Road. Fork in the Road provides something called the Fork Academy, so people in recovery can learn how to cook and can learn basic food hygiene and food preparation standards and achieve a qualification in this. At the end of that journey, they are automatically guaranteed a job interview at McDonald's. Now, many of you might sneeringly say, well, that's hardly a catering career. But in a place of incredibly high unemployment like Middlesbrough, it's a pathway. Their graduates, called recovery ambassadors, have recovery coffee bikes where they'll go out into the housing estates of Middlesbrough and basically say to people, we'll give you a free cup of decent coffee, probably not up to Australian standards, if you talk to us about recovery for 5 to 10 minutes. And they do the same in the collegiate recovery programme in the Teesside University in the city. They'll do exactly the same thing. It's a model about effective community engagement. There's a food van that goes to sporting events that provides opportunities for people. The largest employer in the city, PD Ports, they do their employee assistance programme through Recovery Connections in Middlesbrough. It's an active attempt to make recovery visible, accessible and attractive, to engage people at different stages of their journey. We have 3 inclusive recovery cities in Ireland, Dublin, and this is the Recovery Walk in Dublin, in Galway and in Waterford. I've jumped ahead again. Sorry, my lack of control of my slides. This is the 10 inclusive recovery cities we have in England, and apologies for my appalling cartography. I won't make a map maker. We're just about to have our first inclusive recovery city in Scotland, and maybe more interestingly, we have a total of 14 inclusive recovery cities in the Balkan region, and this is the 7 inclusive recovery cities in Serbia. As things currently stand, there are 32 inclusive recovery cities, and the most recent of those was Cape Town in South Africa. We also have our first inclusive recovery prison. So HMP Liverpool, which is in the city of Liverpool in the northwest of England, is in the process of, as I mentioned right at the start, of embedding a recovery model in a much more strength-based whole prison approach to rehabilitation and recovery. And Liverpool prison, like most English prisons, is overcrowded. There's challenges about both staff turnover and churn of prisoners. But nonetheless, this provides a vision to create a sense of hope, meaning, and purpose for people at different stages of that recovery, of their recovery journey. And I just want to emphasize, by way of closing, that for me, the whole point of a recovery journey is it is not linear. And if you're serious about this model, we have to move away from the idea that there's a kind of line that starts with primary prevention, early intervention, harm reduction services, treatment services, recovery services, where recovery services are characterised as a kind of form of aftercare or through care. It's much more meaningful in this sense to think of that as a donut. As a Scottish person, I like to think about donuts, where it's much more like a cyclical or a circular process, where recovery not only is an end of the journey, it's also a start of the journey. And incidentally, when I was talking about Middlesbrough and the recovery ally training involving naloxone, is that a harm reduction or a recovery intervention? Who cares? It doesn't matter. It involves the recovery community in early life-saving activities and effective community engagement. The point about this is, in this model, making recovery visible and attractive is about effective community engagement to create collective efficacy. And the model for evaluating inclusive recovery cities is based on something taken from criminology, the concept of collective efficacy that's been used in the work of Robert Sampson and is the basis for the Project of Human Development in Chicago neighborhoods. The idea here is recovery is fundamentally about mobilizing community resources to generate community connections, to generate new social connections, to allow the individual the space to build those internal resources to sustain their journey. As a consequence of that, and as a consequence of the contagion component, recovery becomes both a form of primary prevention and a form of targeted prevention. I've talked for a long time. Thank you all very much for your attention and patience, and it's been a privilege to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks, David. That was amazing, and it just highlights the importance of being strength-based and involving peers at every step of someone's journey. We do have one question online. So why do you think males have higher, oops, my phone's turned off, ORCS over time than females?
Yeah. Look, well, it's a really important question, and I think I'm going to answer it in two different ways. When Granfield and Cloud did their original work, they argued there were 5 what they called negative recovery capital factors that were barriers to recovery. And the 5 that they listed were a history of incarceration, a history of mental health problems, a history of physical health problems, being a woman and being older. So we have known for a long time, and when we started doing our recovery housing work, we found that both retention was poorer for women, is less over time. What does that mean? Well, I suspect what that means is 2 things. One, generally recovery housing, like a lot of recovery services, are set up with a primarily white, male, working class alcohol or opiate model in mind. So the services aren't necessarily configured right. And in Victoria, incidentally, we used those findings to generate state funding to create women's only houses. The second factor is stigma and exclusion. One of my PhD students is a woman in recovery herself, and her argument would be being a mother was a fundamental impediment to her recovery journey because she felt as if she constantly had to lie to keep her children with her in any engagement with services. So she never felt for years that she got a fair crack of the whip. She was never able to be open and honest with services because she was constantly concerned about losing her children. So I think there are stigmatising reasons that are to do with labelling, parenting and motherhood. And I think there are service configuration reasons that are about how services are primarily designed for men, not for women.
Thank you. We have another one that's around language. So many associate the word recovery with abstinence. Are people who may have had an issue with one drug but use another allowed to be part of recovery communities?
Yeah, and I guess this has been something really important, and I think this is something that has evolved significantly over time. And we're just finishing a paper in recovery housing in America where we're actually showing that residents who are on MOUD, whether agonist or antagonist, medications for opiate use disorder, have better retention and faster recovery capital growth than completely abstinent people. And this is really important for 2 points. One, MOUD has just become a part of the landscape for a lot of people. And this was a culture that was massively abstinence oriented that's had to rethink itself and rethink what we mean by recovery. And it's really important to say that for us, like, recovery increasingly has come to be much, much more about belonging, about having a sense of meaning and purpose, and to have global and generic physical and psychological health and well-being. And so the concept of abstinence is like the starting point for a recovery journey. It's not there. Many people will choose it. It's not a requirement. I hope that argument about is abstinence a prerequisite is kind of gradually getting put to bed.
Thank you. Were there any questions from the room? No, doesn't look like it. Well, thank you, David. That was fantastic. And we do appreciate the time difference over there. So I hope you can go and get some rest.
Yeah, I'm off back to bed now. So enjoy the rest of your day and thank you very much.